Thank you, Steven Spielberg, for supporting us in our development of these videos to inform students in social work with victims of abuse. This is my colleague, Carlene. She's working for the summer with the Women's Center, the Northern Women's Center, and almost completed her degree in psychology. So we have an interdisciplinary moment going on here today. In our next video, we'll talk about interdisciplinarity, but for today, what I wanted to talk about was grief and loss. So as our semester goes on, we'll talk a lot about patterns, and one of the interesting things about social work with victims of abuse is grief and loss is another one of the patterns. We had talked about shame. There's always, in abuse, there's some shame. Somewhere in the story there's the element of shame, and it's for us to explore that with the clients. There's also always grief, some element of grief, little, big, ongoing, insurmountable. So just to kind of link that, last night I pay attention to my dreams. I also encourage clients to pay attention to their dreams. All of us should. In different cultures, there's different beliefs and values about the wisdom that can come to us through our dreams. So last night I had a dream, lots of layers to it and complexity, and I also try to journal every day. We'll talk about journaling and dreams in another video, but for the moment, in this dream, I couldn't breathe. In the dream, it was an apocalyptic kind of world, and it was very frightening. But interestingly, as I journaled about it, I didn't feel as much frightened as I felt incredibly sad and resigned and surrendering to it. As these walls, it was like a Bruce Willis movie, but with no Bruce Willis. Nobody to save me. And I was in this sort of subterranean space. It was dark, and there were thousands and thousands of people, and we couldn't breathe. And when I was journaling about it, I thought, of course, this is what triggered that for me was, of course, as all of us right now in the world who care about Black Lives Matter, and that is the line that man was saying as the 4 police officers murdered him. I can't breathe. As I was journaling about it, I reflected upon maybe 2 years ago, there was a white man that Trump was appointing to be a Supreme Court Justice, Kavanaugh, and he was outed as someone who had sexually assaulted a woman much earlier in his life. If you remember witnessing all of those testimonies and all the media around it, one of her fears in the moment was that he was going to murder her, and she said maybe by accident he was going to murder her because he had put his hand over her face and she couldn't breathe. So I bring that into our conversation right now. Grief and loss, fear, shame, feeling sometimes of resignation, and the solidarity between the pattern I wish to point at. This man felt in those last 10 minutes of his life helpless, lost, afraid, panicky, all kinds of feelings. This woman who was sexually assaulted was feeling all of those same feelings. She couldn't breathe. We hear people say, oh, these mansplainers in the room, they took up all the oxygen. Right? I heard that expression and I think it fits. A lot of times, the grief and loss and sometimes the feelings of resignation or helplessness around all of this oppression, whether it's racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, the pattern of all the oppressions, is it can feel constricting. It can feel for our victims like they can't breathe, right? And there's grief around that. There's a sense of loss. There's a sense of, how can I get my air back? How can I stand tall and inhale deeply? Mm-hmm. Right? And I think we've had, even when a relationship crashes, you have that feeling of your chest feels constricted. Mm-hmm. It's part of a pattern. So what we wish to do is to put the grief or loss in the room as a conversational topic and ask people, somewhere in your story of your life, there's grief and loss. can we talk about that? Can you think of other times maybe in your life? So a person may come to you and tell you this story today, but there's something maybe behind that that gets triggered and triggered. Like my dream was triggered by witnessing all of this in the media and feeling an empathy and a companionship to this person. Do you have any stories that come to your mind when you reflect on this, of grief and loss and that feeling of constriction?
I mean, like you had mentioned, breakups, and I've recently gone through a pretty important breakup with a significant other. And I'd say definitely one of the most serious breakups that I've ever had. So I think it's isolating.
Isolating, fear, aloneness. There's a whole kind of cluster there to explore under that category of grief and loss.
Mm-hmm.
And that might not at first be apparent to a person. So let's say if you had, and I'll tell you a story from when I worked in the social assault treatment program. So a young girl who's maybe 14, lives in a rural context, is sexually abused for years by her father's brother, so her uncle. She discloses to her mother what's been going on. Her mother immediately does the best thing. Says it's not your fault, this shouldn't have happened, your uncle's bad, etc. The girl loves her father, and in a way loves her uncle. This is again that's part of why abuse can be very complicated and painful. They often feel an affection for the abuser. That's how the abuser sets up the situation. So in this story, and I'll give you it as kind of an iconic story, an example story, a teaching story. So the girl discloses to her mother. The mother says to her husband, whom she loves, your brother is doing this to our daughter. He says, the girl's lying. My brother would never do that. The mother and the daughter do their best to say, no, we're not lying, this happened, it's been going on, da-da-da-da-da. The father says, I'll never believe that my brother would do that. And of course, when they confront the uncle, he says it never happened, she's lying, all these things, right? So, the daughter now has lost the love and belief of her father, her trust in her father. She loses her faith and belief in her uncle. Her grandmother was a very close relationship. She loved her paternal grandmother. The mother says, the grandmother says, my son would never sexually abuse his niece. That's not true. She's lying. So this 14-year-old girl goes from kind of having this extended family, the love of her grandmother, the love of her father, almost overnight, to the uncle saying she's a lying little whore, the father saying, I don't understand why you're lying like this about your uncle. The grandmother says, I don't even want you around me. You're a liar and you're trying to destroy my son. The mother does the right thing. She moves out. The mother with the girl moves out. In rural and northern contexts, it's difficult to find an apartment, right? Yeah. It's very difficult. So the mother takes her 14-year-old girl and leaves. So let's say here in this context, be like if this whole story unfolded in Quesnel. That's a small community of, what is in Quesnel? 10,000 people?
Something like that.
Let's say.
I have no idea.
We'll say 10,000, a small community.
Yep.
So the mother and the daughter move to Prince George for now. That's the quickest place they can find. The girl has now lost her home. So she has loss and grief over the father, the uncle, the grandma, her home. She's suddenly moved to a new place.
So probably her support network.
Her support network, her resources, her friends. She also has to change school. So she loses all of that support and familiarity.
and associated comfort with that.
Yeah, she's also going to have, this is a true story I'm telling you, and a very statistically kind of common story as these things unfold. A lot of her other extended kin feel they have to take sides. Either you're for her or against her. That's how the story often will flow. If you believe her, well, you can't believe the uncle. Like it becomes a
mutually exclusive thing
Yeah.
where you have to pick sides.
You have to pick sides. So as this story unfolds, within a month, let's say, of the disclosure, the girl feels grandma hates me, my dad hates me, my mom hates my dad. That's how she's feeling, whether that's fully the complexity of it or not.
Yeah, she's probably thinking that she affected her mom's relationship with both her dad and her uncle.
She feels that if I had just kept my mouth shut,
None of this would have happened.
none of this would happen. And that can be the kind of energy that comes at her. This true story continues to unfold. And in her new school, because Prince George is not that far from Quesnel, in her new school, she's known as the girl who's been fucking her uncle for years. Kids can be really cruel to each other. And she's crushed as this rumor goes around in her new school. She's the girl who's been sexually abused. And it should be more of a private matter. But in small communities, these things pretty quickly come out. So this young girl, in a very short time, has lost so much and has all this grief, all this loss, all this shame. All of this comes on her as the legal system becomes involved because she's underage and the mom calls the police and things unfold. She feels she's lost control of her life.
Mm-hmm.
So the loss and grief of she can't pull any of it back. People are saying things about her and she can't change any of it. Her mom is very sad and upset because she too has lost her home, her family, her community, her husband. Things have just become awful on many, many layers. Another grief and loss thing that will happen around all this is often there's an element of a feeling of safety. A bit of water here.
Where all of a sudden, because those things like family can be grounding, if that's uprooted, then you don't feel safe anymore.
Precisely. She doesn't feel safe. One of the people will say, I lost my innocence when this happened. This assault, this abuse, this homophobic attack, when these things happened at work where I was sexually harassed. People say, I've lost my innocence. And I think what they often mean about that is, I've lost my sense of being able to believe in other people. I believed my grandmother loved me unconditionally, but she's betrayed me and abandoned me. And once you get that feeling of people I used to believe in, I used to think I understood, we all like to have our own sense of a third eye of the world, a sense of, I know who I can trust, I know who I can believe in, I know how things work in human affairs. This can feel completely blindsiding. It can knock you over, and you think, well, how can the kids at school be so cruel to me? How can they say these things? And then you think, well, I'm not going to trust people at school because maybe they'll betray me, or I'm not going to trust my grandparents or elderly people, or why should I trust anyone? You're all fucking liars. You're all betrayers. That's when people say, I lost my innocence. That's sometimes what they mean. I lost my sense of how the world works and how humans are. And I really believe once you've had some huge betrayal like this in life, it is almost impossible to get to a place of
Blind trust in people.
yeah, blind trust, faith, innocence. It can become the other way of, you prove to me why I should trust you, right? That sort of stance of,
Respect is earned.
and in a way it's good to be wise, but it can also put people in a more painful place, right? So with everybody who's gone through any of these kinds of things, reflect with them, talk to them about grief and loss. What do you feel you may have lost? And it may not be rational. Let's put that right out there. When you're working with social work with victims of abuse, stuff is not rational.
I'm not a well, I mean, I guess, depending on, but like, You know, like, I have things that I get really upset about. Like, I on my period, the fact that I don't have gummy bears, really upsetting.
Okay.
Worth crying over.
That may not be logical, rational, sequential. So let's be really
Equal
clear.
to the moment.
Yeah, when you're working with social work with victims of abuse, things can hurt people's feelings in a way that is not linear, sequential. It's not A, B, C. People can feel things
They don't make sense.
that don't make rational, logical sense. So, for example, the dream I started this talk with, where I said, in the dream, I felt I need to get air. I need to find air. I need to be safe. I need to find the ways up where the air is. A dream is not a rational, logical, sequential thing, but it's very important.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important to talk to your clients about their dreams. It can be very important to get gummy bears for people who need gummy bears. That can build, if you said that to me, if you were my client and you made a comment about that, and the next time our appointment came and I had gummy bears, or I remembered that you said that, that's going to make you feel seen, heard, cared about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus if I said to you, well, that's not a very rational longing. Gummy bears aren't even nutritional.
I don't want to hear that.
It's not going to help you, right? That's not going to enhance you. So, and so we've touched upon in this kind of conversation, talk about the grief and loss. People can feel isolated by the abuse, so you want to establish senses of connection and belonging. You want to talk to them about their dignity. They've lost their dignity. One of the things, if you ever spend time with lots of sexual abuse victims, as I have in group therapy or in classrooms or something, a lot of the ways in my life I've had those experiences. One of the first things a victim will want is her dignity. So if I gave you an example of a stranger assault in a parking lot, we'll take that, although statistically that's not very common. But let's say one of the first things a victim will do, so let's say we'll make a storyline. A young woman is going to her car in a parking lot. Someone comes up behind her, sexually assaults her, throws her on the ground, traumatizes her. One of the first things she will have an impulse to do is reclaim her dignity. She will cover herself up. She will want to set her hair in place a little bit, and then she'll call the police or call her friend. It's our human longing to have our dignity restored. That's a spontaneous craving. So how do we help clients talk about that? You'll often hear in stories, this happened to me, this horrible assault, and I went home. I didn't want to tell anyone because I felt ashamed. My dignity was eroded, was demolished. I needed to take a bath. Right? The rational, logical thing a person should do, now that we all have seen CSI kind of shows, is don't wash away evidence. But still there's that powerful, I got to get this off of me. It's so filthy. I feel ruined. I feel disgusted. I feel repulsed. I feel horrible. Right? And often that will become the thing. People will say, if you really were sexually assaulted, you would have known better than to go home and take a shower. That's not rational. Mm-hmm. Or you would say,
why didn't you just go to the hospital?
Right, people say that would be the first, if you really were sexually assaulted, the first thing you would do is call the police. Well, maybe not. Maybe the first thing is she needs to kind of think about what happened, or what's going on here, or why me, or where's my mom, or I need gummy bears, or a person in those moments. It's not always rational, logical, sequential, empirical, evidence-based. Right? That's another thing. So people will want to feel reconnected. They feel isolated. They have had their dignity assaulted, and they may have an overwhelming urge for safety. So why did they not go directly to the hospital? Why did they not go directly to the police station? They went directly to their best friend's house.
Maybe they don't have a car and their best friend needs to drive them.
Right, and they felt they had their friend makes them feel safe. A police officer may not make them feel safe. especially if they're Indigenous, especially if they are a Black Lives Matter person, especially if in the past police have somehow offended them or taught them that they were lesser beings. So for example, if you are a sex trade worker and you're sexually assaulted by a client, the first thing you might do is call your sister. You might not call the police because you may think the police aren't going to protect me anyway. Maybe once you've had time to reflect, then you will call the police, but that might not be your first safety, right? So that is a kind of pattern, all of these things. Isolation, return to dignity, safety, their trusting, faithful relationships matter. Not necessarily the police officer, it might be they call their friend. They might want to go home before they go anywhere else because they may want to reclaim their dignity. If the perpetrator ripped open their blouse, or if they were in drunk and they barfed, or the perpetrator put semen on their top, they may feel such a clawing urge to get that off of them that they'll go home and change their clothes. And again, someone could say, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you immediately go to the police and the hospital?
Yeah.
They don't feel the dignity, the cleanliness, the home, the health, the safety are in those places, right? The other things that people can lose because of these abuses is their health and their sobriety. So a person who maybe has been clean and they've struggled with drugs and alcohol, and then they get abused in some way, they might go home and get drunk. And someone will say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You're at a party, you've been sober for 3 years, you haven't been using drugs and alcohol, you get sexually assaulted, and the first thing you do is go to a crack shack and get stoned? Bizarre, right? But that might, for them, be a way of retrieving some comfort and mercy in the story. Then, if they go to the police 2 days later and say, I've had a chance now to reflect on this, I want to talk to a police officer about what happened, someone could say, well, if it really was a sexual assault, you wouldn't have just gone direct to a crack shack, right?
So they're just judging your coping mechanisms, which might not necessarily be the most healthy, but they do temporarily do the job of getting you through that moment.
Exactly. And so we want to just respect that. Don't put a judgment. That's what it is. They're
Accept
not
it
here.
as a fact.
That's not even what they're here to talk to you about. So if you're a social worker, let's say in a youth group home, and a client has gone AWOL for 3 days or 5 days, and they come back and you can tell they've been using, or they talk about that they've been stoned or using, or they come back and they're still using, and you say, and you start putting shame and judgment on them about, well, here we are again, right? You've gone off the wagon, and now you're telling me your excuse for going off the wagon is someone sexually harassed you or abused you or choked you or beat you up or stole your purse or screamed homophobic things at you or whatever. Get rid of all this judgment. This is not useful. This is not accurate. What is better, accurate within the stories of these kind of moments, it's better to say, I'm just so glad you showed up today. I'm glad you come back. I'm glad you're safe. I was worried about you, to that young person in the youth group home. Tell me what you've been up to. What's going on? How can I help you? You know? Go with that. Trust that they did what they needed to do to get through this horrible episode.
And what you can control is what happens moving forward.
Right. Move forward. And help them understand that. My father, as I've said in a previous video, sexually abused me during my childhood. And one of the implicit things that happens in sexual abuse is don't talk, right? So whether the perpetrator's always put his hand on your mouth or not, they're implicitly saying, I don't care about your voice. I don't care about your opinion. You don't matter.
And it's important that you stay quiet.
You stay quiet. Exactly. So they may have implicitly and explicitly told you that 100 times in 100 ways. So here's a moment that I'm trying to kind of teach you something here. So I'm in a psychology class. I've had lots of healing and lots of things, and my life is going better. I'm in a psychology class, a white male professor who I just get the vibe from hates women. In a lot of the things he said, but I won't belabor my point. So I hand him one of my assignments, and this is a long time ago when we used whiteout and we had typewriters. So some of you may not know what a typewriter is. Look it up, Google it. But I would type and you would white things out. And so sometimes I had lots of whiteout. And what I would do, because whiteout is kind of like crinkly, lumpy if you put too much of it, I would photocopy my final paper so that you didn't have all the whiteout. It would look nicer. And I handed him my paper. And I got an A+ on the paper, and I was very happy about that because I could tell this guy was not going to be my buddy, right? But then he wrote in pen that plagiarism and having other people do our assignments for us would get us expelled from the university. Some stuff like this, and I was like, what is, he's accusing me that, it took me a minute to even kind of figure out what is this? He was inferring that since I had photocopied my assignment, it must be a cheated assignment. And I was just appalled that he had accused me of this. He also was suggesting that someone like you, whatever that, implicitly, someone like you can't legitimately earn an A+. Right?
That you couldn't have produced that quality of work based on what he judged as your quality of work.
I was just crushed. I was so ashamed. I was so embarrassed. And I had never spoken to him. Right? These are classes of like 45 students, and I kind of would sit at the back, and the next class, or maybe 2 classes after I received this assignment, I noticed this pattern. He would say, does anybody have any questions? So nobody has any questions, and he'd go back to the board, right? And then I started noticing, does anybody have a thought about chapter 6 or something like that? So given that, oh, Bob, do you have a question? That's a very good question, Bob. I was noticing this is 35 years ago-ish, right? He was, when the men in the class put their hand up, he would respond to them. When the women put their hand up in the class, he would say, oh, so there's no questions.
And just go ignore you.
And ignore me.
So that you weren't good enough to deserve a response.
Exactly. So what is that subconsciously? He's called me a liar in my document.
And now won't acknowledge you.
Every time, until I had that epiphany, every time when I was going to that class, in that class, leaving that class, I had felt shaky and like I was going to cry. But once I had an epiphany about, this is like being abused. This is like what my father did to me. It lifted my energy a little bit. It helped me feel more empowered, helped me feel clarified. And then once I started watching it, oh, Bob had a smart question, right? But the women had nothing to say. I know that sounds unbelievable. I would hope none of your teachers ever do that now. But that happened.
Yeah, and that's not hard to believe, which is upsetting.
It was upsetting. So helping your clients understand that the shame, the grief, the loss, the disempowerment, the silencing, there's lots of ways that can get triggered. Now, had I at the time had a drinking problem or an alcohol problem, or a drug problem, I could very much imagine someone going through those experiences, feeling really sad, going home with a bottle of vodka. Mm. I could imagine that, right? Because they've been triggered. Helping them consciously realize there are triggers out there all the time for our shame, our grief, our loss. The more you can understand the triggers and bring them to your conscious mind, the more empowered you'll be. And this is part of how we can be so helpful to our clients, to help them understand that's what's happening. Like start tracking your dreams, or start tracking or journaling when you're in a class. In my story, if someone had been my therapist at the time, when do you feel these feelings during your week? In what ways is this a parallel to another era of your life? Right? And it can, or I think in a previous video we talked about a person can feel ashamed about her body just walking through the mall. Because if you're a fuller figured person, or an older person, or if you don't meet the mannequin model type size 1 or 0 or 2 or something, or you don't have the money to buy all those beautiful things in the mall, you'll feel ashamed. And it can lead you to feel you sink, right? 2 or 3 things. So for today, that was something I really want to talk about. That's part of the pattern. Anytime you're working with victims of abuse, whether that's elder abuse, homophobic abuse, racial abuse, all different kinds of abuse, grief and loss should be part of what we talk about, and it may be a little bit or a lot. It may come from the side. It may be something that isn't rational, logical, sequential. It's sort of intuitive. It's a third eye. It's the subconscious. And it's potent. To not talk about it with your clients is to neglect something that could set them up to go backwards. The story of the 14-year-old girl and all the losses that she had. I spent maybe 14 sessions over 14 weeks talking about each one of those kinds of losses and how we could accomplish gains. So she lost her friends when she moved from that community to this. How can we make new friends? What new hobbies can we get? Can we sign you up for clubs or groups or skating, or what might help you to have more friendships going on? So kind of pragmatic step by step of how do we reaccomplish whatever they feel they've lost. So thank you again, Steven Spielberg, for helping us accomplish this. And thank you, Carlene, for being here as my conversationalist partner.
No problem.